Hi, this is Paul. Wanted to follow up on Wednesday's video on Jordan Petersonitis and his faith. As I said quite a bit in that video, wound up being about 3 hours. I wanted to get into Klaven's recent conversation with Peterson. A note on this, again, for those of you who are new to my channel, what am I doing? Well, I'm basically thinking out loud. I don't so much think of myself as a content producer, but more of these videos as ways for me to discipline my ADHD and have an opportunity to think out loud and think in public and think in conjunction with you all. And I usually go through the comments and read them, skim them, watch on Twitter. One of the things that I've added to my practice recently has been doing a Twitter summary and then in conjunction with my Twitter summary, a Substack summary of the previous day's videos. I found that to be quite helpful because I usually don't know how a video is going to end when I start it, and I usually have insight or realizations in the process of doing the video, and then I want to capture those and solidify those, and often it's best to do it the next morning, mornings because I'm freshest and have had a chance to sleep on the video that I created and probably have some additional insights and can sort of solidify them. Another reason I do it is because who on earth has time to watch all the video that I produce? Now, some of you do because either you're, you're a heavy YouTube user, you've got a way of doing other things while you're listening to me. I sometimes describe what I'm doing here as sort of AM radio for a lot of people. Or you have a job where you simply, you're a coder or something and you simply listen to a lot of content. That's a rather particular and specialized audience, and there's a larger potential audience out there who just basically want a summary of a written summary. And I don't know if this Substack thing is going to work or not long term. We'll just keep playing around with it and see. As long as it sort of works for me. Those of you who know my personal blog, which is leadingchurch.com, that I've been doing since the 2000 aughts, that's always sort of been a file cabinet. And in many ways, my YouTube channel has become sort of a version of that. I still use leadingchurch.com for putting down notes and links. And I warned people at the beginning there that just because I post something there doesn't mean I'm necessarily going to comment on it or I agree with it or I disagree with it. It's just a place to put stuff. And I found early on that using a blog was an excellent filing cabinet because no matter what device I had in my pocket or where I was in the world, I can open that up and find the content I'm looking for, and I can also share it with you all. And sometimes you all have good comments and helpful pointers for other things. So that's sort of why I do what I do. So the link to this Substack will be in the links below. If you're following me on Twitter, I usually do sort of a long tweet thread and then conclude it with a link to the Substack if I've managed to cut and paste all of the text and clean it up a little bit and have it work. In yesterday's video, I'll just say yesterday because I posted it on Wednesday, I commented on David Fuller and Jonathan Rowson's Jordan Petersonitis video. And those of you who saw the 3 hours know what I said there. One of the things I have a link to David Fuller's Could This Man Save Western Civilization piece that they talked about a little bit. I talked about guidelines versus rules, which was something that sort of came to me as I was doing the videos, linked to maps of meaning. Talked about the grime line, hard line, soft lines, had a link to that video that I had done before. Talked about while he always trusts me, I'm talking about a convert, and I talked about this in the video. While he always trusted me and considered me his pastor, he attended the kinds of gritty churches where pastors who had themselves done time in prison dish out bright lines and clear rules for living. The academic overclass loves to deconstruct these rules, highlighting their theoretical insufficiencies and limitations. They too often fail to recognize their utility for people struggling with chaos. However, any functional lighthouses more useful in a storm than 1,000 better lighthouses debated in the academy. Jordan Peterson, as a clinical psychologist, was very much in touch with this. And then I get into heroes a little bit. Heroic heroes are at the center of Jordan Peterson's salvific vision, which he takes from Christianity. What's often missing is that he hasn't taken from Christianity, which is seeing heroes not as individuals, but as members of a body of an archetypal hero. Peterson's understanding of what I call grime lines are deep in his character and were on full display in the telling of his daughter's suffering in 12 Rules for Life. Heroic heroes, I'm going to have to clean that up. I think some of the best critique that Foley David and Jonathan Rowson offered in this conversation focus on the limitations of individualism and Peterson's stuckness in it. These are the issues that were some of the most powerful points in the engagement between Jonathan Pageau and Jordan Peterson. And there's the Klaven stuff. That's this video. Peterson can see the rules, hard lines, and grime lines when it comes to confronting the suffering of being in this world, but shrinks back from these when it comes to communal application. All human heroes, including biblical heroes, fail, but are redeemed as mere members of the archetypal hero by being in Christ. In the body, each hero is relieved of not having to shoulder the full weight of being, as it is shared by the body that transcends time and space. And when Pageau was talking about needing the church, I think that's very much what he's talking about. Christ is the archetypal hero, and all other heroes are seen in Christ. If you were a listener to, let's say, Tim Keller's preaching, he would often use the tact of, Jesus is a new and better Moses. Jesus is a new and better David, connecting all of those Old Testament heroes to Christ himself. Theoretical participation always pales compared to actual participation. The optimistic engagement with being must find communal manifestation in a body larger than simply his fans. You remember Peterson and Pageau talking about his fans, and Peterson basically, fans are kind of a church. And Pageau was right when he said, no, fans really aren't a church. Fans sort of invoke the mooks and knights dynamic. The head of the body of fans is the knight, and the knight is always susceptible to the mooks that make up that body. The body of Christ does not work that way. My sound is low again. I did Zoom today. This will be the only time you have to readjust the sound. Zoom always turns, there's a setting on my mic level that Zoom always turns down to 70, and I have to turn up back to 90 when I do one of these videos. So that's sometimes what happens. The head of the body of fans is the knight, and the knight is always susceptible to the mooks that make up that body, and that's from the Internet of Beefs piece. The body of Christ does not work that way. There is freedom from mooks and members, while there is also accountability and community, which all heroes need. You don't need to tell a pastor just how imperfect participation in Christ's body is in this world. I've got more stories than you have time to listen to. Yet there is no other way, theoretically and practically. Inflammations are strange combinations of the body healing itself and harming itself. I hope Jordan Petersonitis continues because I think while painful, it has been profitable. Maybe we'll do better in Jordan Peterson wave number 2. And he is in wave number 2. Number 2 is at this point well underway. And part of that has been Andrew Klavan. Now, in the past, I've mentioned Klavan before. I really enjoyed his spiritual memoir, The Great Good Thing. And I found it to be just a sweet, beautiful book. Now, he has, in fact, spoken with Jordan Peterson a few times. And in this interview in 2018, he basically articulates pretty much what I've heard him say about Jordan Peterson. Because, again, when something comes across the web, many of you pointed out to me, and I've listened to a number of his usually more offhand statements about Jordan and where he's at with respect to faith. Klaven usually says almost exactly the same thing.
What do you think of Jordan Peterson's rise, his message, and the impact he's having on culture?
Well, I like Jordan Peterson a lot, and I pat myself on the back for having discovered him very early on. I had him on the show, and I think one of his YouTube videos had something like 700 views on it because he was fighting a good fight in Canada for free speech. I asked him, I've done 2 interviews with him, and I asked him during the second interview, I said to him, you sound like me 5 years before I was baptized.
Great.
And I do think that with all respect to him, he's a very, obviously a very bright man and a very honest man. With all due respect for him, I think he is he's like a moth fluttering around the flame of Christ, afraid that if he goes in, he will lose his intellectual cred. And I think that everything he says can be resolved in Christian theology, and he is playing with the sort of intellectual what's the word I want? Rhetoric, I guess. The intellectual rhetoric that keeps away from just accepting the truth.
Yeah.
Now, I think Klaven here nicely articulates a sentiment I hear a lot and have heard a lot for the 3+ years that I've been making these videos and speaking with you and listening to you, that there are a group of Christians out there that see Jordan Peterson progressing towards Christianity and he's going to cross the line, etc., etc. And after listening to various statements by Jordan over the years, to me, he's always sounded sort of where he's always been. I've spoken with a number of people over the years who were students of his, grad students of his, and many of them made the observation to me that part of his power as a speaker is that when he's talking about even something that he's been talking about for the last 20 years, it always seems fresh because it always seems to sort of be emerging from him. I'm not claiming any duplicity or dishonesty in that, but I've noticed that too. And I've been only listening to him for a few years, but I've been listening fairly carefully. And so the question about Christianity, for me, obviously, is an interesting one. And I just had a conversation today with a couple of different very interesting randos. Only one of them will show up on the channel. Pastor Tanner was one of them. And, one of the things that I said to Pastor Tanner is that the questions of where the lines are with respect to Christianity are going to continue to get strange and confusing, partly because the systems we're working with now are very much legacy systems of Protestant confessionalism. In other words, we label people by the theological beliefs they subscribe to. If you subscribe to these key ones, you're Roman Catholic. If you subscribe to these key ones, you're Orthodox. These key ones, you're Baptist or Reformed or Lutheran or Pentecostal. And that's sort of how we keep order and categorize things. Part of what has developed in the Tom Holland conversation, and Jordan got there very quickly when he would say things to Sam Harris like, well, I act as if I believe in God and you sort of do too. And of course, this would throw Sam Harris back because he's known for stating that he does not believe in God. But Jordan's like, well, I'm skeptical because your actions betray a lower level of belief, even if here on the surface you say you don't. And this gets into this question of, okay, how do we label each other with respect to this enormous label of Christianity? Because I think many of my videos, the conversations with Tom Holland, increasingly more and more people seem to be aware and accepting of the fact that the default, the broad default moral settings of the West have been inherited from Christianity. John Gray makes this point. Jordan Peterson, Douglas Murray. I'm writing a piece for Unbelievable, their blog. Jordan Peterson, Tom Holland, Douglas Murray all make this case that if we lose this inheritance, we might lose this broad moral assumption, this moral matrix, this ethical code that Sam Harris employs in order to critique and try to debunk Christians. And part of what, I really like what Dr. Jim, the cardiologist from Idaho, said when he sort of, because he's a very good thinker and a very careful listener, when he said, the new atheists arose, and then Jordan Peterson arose basically because their worldview is slipping away, and likely deep beneath the surface they feel that somehow, so they feel the need to rise up and defend it. And that need manifested in groups is well known. The fundamentalists, Christian fundamentalists, of course, have been doing that as modernity continued to increase all the way to its peak, probably in the early 20th century. And so I was just listening to Jonathan Peugeot and Rafe Kelly conversation, and Peugeot, is basically making the same point, that modernity is receding, and the rise of new atheism was a part of that. And the rise of the IDW is part of that as well. Whereas, a good number of the IDW was always quite new atheist adjacent in some ways. And that's sort of what made Jordan Peterson a very interesting figure, I think a liminal figure, and sort of a bridge from back into mythology, back into understanding religion as an essential element of life. But yet, someone like Andrew Klavan, well, he's not. Andrew Klavan, as he writes in his book, The Great Good Thing, crosses the line. And the existence of those lines are, as I said, even though Andrew Klavan went to Roman Catholicism, remnants of confessional Protestantism. And again, once I release, and I will release my conversation with Pastor Tanner, I go into that a little bit more in the same way that it's very difficult for any of us to be, to one degree or another, postmodern. It's very difficult for many Roman Catholics and Orthodox to be, to one degree or not, Protestant. And I'll just let the comments that I say to Pastor Tanner stand when I play that video, which will probably be quite soon. He's got a smaller channel than mine, so I'll give him a chance to play it first, and then I'll play it on my channel. Well, let's get into this video then and start working on it.
Well, one of my favorite pieces of advice in the new book, Beyond Order: 12 More Rules for Life, is abandon ideology. And just to read a very brief section of it.
And again, back to the Jordan Peterson-itis, one of the things that Jonathan Rowson, I think, said, and I was persuaded by it, part of the irony of this point with Peterson, which is one that he makes in both books, is that he himself runs the danger of becoming ideological. And he does so basically with his own definition, by sort of keeping the church at arm's length, because it's going to be difficult to manifest the full range of a religion and not reduce it down to an ideology if you're not somehow nested within a Christian community. I'll say it that way. Or at least a vigorous Christian community, because again, part of the irony of Tom Holland's thesis is it sort of allows us to reimagine Christendom even in a secular world, and sees secularity as another manifestation of Christendom. So Peterson's definition of ideology, I think, is a good one, but by that own definition, he runs the risk of being ideological with respect to the way that he's dealing with religion formally.
It says, have some humility, clean up your bedroom, take care of your family, follow your conscience, straighten up your life. And when you can do all that, find a bigger problem and try to solve that if you dare.
And again, this is sort of a retake of Rule 6 from 12 Rules for Life, his first book. So it's interesting that Klaven picks on this, and of course that was the point that Rowson really differed with, and he and Peterson got into kind of a bickering match in that RSA interview.
I read that Bill Gates came to mind, a guy trying to change the world who can't keep his marriage.
The Gates divorce, I've been sort of following that and some of the pieces coming out. It's, of course, every divorce is a sad thing. The first conversation that I had today, he said it was okay if I'd mention it, is an individual who, like many of the conversations that I've had, a child of divorce. This person's father, in fact, was a Christian minister and had an affair. And of course, I always think about Andrew Root's excellent book, Children of Divorce, and how divorce, even when the children are adults, divorce becomes sort of an ontological crisis for the children, because that marriage, that union, they are the fruit of it.
Together, but is ideology an escape from personal failure? Is that what we're dealing with, or is something bigger going on? Because the Western world certainly seems to be in the grips of ideology beyond all reason.
There's as is always the case, there's probably a multitude of reasons. I mean, we all want to explain as much of the world as we.
And before he continues on, again, there's a lot of critique of Peterson that says he's reductive, but he, more than many, continues to remind people that they are, these are all multivariable problems. And so by virtue of, he doesn't say this necessarily, but by virtue of the nature of speech, we almost always reduce every multivariable problem to at least two issues, one at a time, and in almost every case some hierarchy will develop, which again is usually debatable.
Reason. As is always the case, there's probably a multitude of reasons. I mean, we all want to explain as much of the world as we can because we want to be able to predict the world and to control it to some degree. And so if we're offered up an explanatory theory that conveniently explains virtually everything, and we don't have to test it rigorously in all of its applications, we can just assume that it's correct without rigorously testing it. Well, there's a certain comfort in that. Then there's the attraction of being able to band together with like-minded others, and that's not all reprehensible. Then there's the social critique element of it, and God knows that there are problems with our systems and our culture, and so it's reasonable to want to be on the side that's improving them. But mostly I see it as a substitute for genuine religious endeavor. I've thought for a long time, I wrote about this extensively in my first book, Maps of Meaning, that ideology is a parasite on religion, essentially. Cognitively speaking, is that we need a domain that addresses the most fundamental issues in life. This is regardless of your belief in God in some sense. It's a separate issue. Psychologically speaking, there's a unifying tendency in our ethical striving that promotes a kind of monotheistic thinking. And that needs to be parsed out into genuine religious endeavor. And
again, there's a degree of irony in this. Okay, what do we mean by genuine religious endeavor? Now, In previous videos, I've talked about religion S, which is sort of the secular definition of religion. Religion has to do with the supernatural and with gods, and that would be the definition of religion that Sam Harris would use. And then religion W, like a worldview, and that's the sense in which Peterson is using it. But yet, Peterson stands outside of what would be seen as secular from a secular perspective of what would be religious practice. And so, as Rowson noted, I mean, Rowson would talk about him as a dynamic speaker, and I always saw him as sort of a preacher, but he's the strangest sort of preacher. And again, the one, it was in the Toronto Star where a former colleague of his made the comment that Jordan was looking around for a church to buy, so that apparently he could hold forth. But now, of course, no one can fault his efforts because he's got the size following that he would be hard pressed to fit into a church, and so he's actually better off renting halls and things of that nature. So all of these comments about religion are peculiar by the fact that, at least with this one definition of religion, he's not a religious figure. But of course, he speaks about religion a lot, and that's the area of his work that I have the most interest in.
If it isn't in our ethical striving that promotes a kind of monotheistic thinking, and that needs to be parsed out into genuine religious endeavor. And if it isn't, then it contaminates other domains of endeavor. They become inevitably, they expand to take that place.
Now, when you get to David Fuller and Jonathan Rowson's critique of Peterson as he himself getting ideological, he fits his own description here. It just does. Because, well, okay, why the susceptibility to get trapped in political culture war things? And I know he himself many times says, I don't think of myself as a political figure. And fair enough, he keeps getting cornered by reporters and people like that who want to take him in a political direction. And again, as in the Jordan Petersonitis video, I completely agree that given the amount of pressure and the size of the assault in terms of the status and the power in our society, who can fault the man? But to me, it accentuates the appeal of his friend Jonathan Pageau, who says, run for shelter in the church. Why? Well, because you need something that big and that strong to hold off the political. And if by your own analysis, you note that without an overt religion that you are actually practicing, and that will involve doing things in continuation with a tradition so that the integration is both horizontal in terms of people today will know what you're doing, but also vertical in terms of connecting up historically with religious traditions, you're just going to be susceptible to ideology. This is his framework, and I think he's dead on right. This is, in fact, the reason why, in my experience, many who deconstruct from a practiced religion wind up using politics as the methadone replacement for that true religion, the true opiate. So, again, it's hard not to listen to this and say, flee ye to the church, Jordan, if you want a remedy from the pitfalls of ideology.
And I think this is a truth, a psychological truth, that the new atheists, for example, have failed entirely to recognize or grapple with. It's like, well, what if we are religious by nature? And I mean, what does that imply metaphysically? That's a very, very deep question and a separate question. But if we are religious by nature, and I do believe the evidence supports that view, then what happens if that instinct isn't being fulfilled? And the answer for me is that, well, it just finds its satisfaction in secondary sources. So instead,
and as a pastor, these are difficult places to tread, because obviously the church is not by any means a perfect sanctuary for this. And the history of the state of Georgia just elected a preacher to the U.S. Senate. In the black church tradition, it's often been the case that pastors and ministers get into politics. Martin Luther King Jr. never ran for office, but was obviously politically very involved. Jesse Jackson ran for president. A good number. Al Sharpton is mostly known for his political activism. So, these are issues. But, again, listening to his own words and knowing how slippery that slope is, when I hear what he's saying here, he's basically saying, if you can default to the religious language, if you could act religiously, you run a better chance of resisting this kind of substitution that, in fact, our entire society is susceptible to.
instead of worshiping Christ, let's say, and we could imagine Christ.
And again, Peugeot worshiping. Well, why Peugeot? Some of the clearest stuff that Peugeot has said, he said to Rafe Kelly. Part of what Rafe Kelly is so good at, pulling out of Vervaeke, pulling out of me, pulling out of Peugeot. I mean, Rafe is obviously a clear thinker, but also Rafe is. He had a little. Rafe, in his conversation with Peugeot, had a little advertisement for his workshop, and boy, that looked like fun. And so Rafe is working hard at integration, as if you listen to the last two conversations that I had, and then my conversation with Rafe and John Vervaeke together. Rafe is, he's asking these deep questions about Christianity. And I think part of the reason Rafe is doing this is because he understands, by virtue of his practice, that you need to act it out. And part of acting it out is not just what we do with our bodies, but what we do with our tongues and what we do with our words. And in Peterson's conversation with Peugeot, what we do with our attention, what we look at. And again, Peugeot said, in order to actually form a community, and I think he's dead on right, you have to have something above the community around which the community forms. Jonathan Haidt, in fact, has a diagram which he talks about this, and how, at the Hajj in Mecca, they go round and round. You find this again and again in human beings. And so, Jordan keeps, again, I think about Klaven's, he's sort of the moth circling the flame. And Klaven said, well, maybe he's 5 years from it. Well, he's been circling that flame for a couple of decades.
Momentarily, as our imaginative representation of the ideal human being, which and his figure is at least that, even technically speaking. We admire Che Guevara or some subsidiary substitute who has some of the attributes of the mythological hero, of the central mythological hero, but is lacking many of them, and we missed.
And this, again, when you get into my Substack piece, the difference between individuals and members. Che Guevara, I mean, a lot of people are, try to fit him in with this Voltron, this archetypal hero. He's got to fit in with the rest of the heroes and be a member and not an individual. But then when you look at him and you compare him with the other elements within the hierarchy, within the archetypal hero who is Christ, that's when the dissonance will begin to be seen. And it's that dissonance that begins to refine us and change us and say, yeah, okay, well, I suppose to whatever degree he actually attempted to fulfill the gospel of Isaiah and bring good news to the poor, okay, but do all of the other elements of his story actually fit in? And the story itself critiques and molds and changes us.
Take the Che Guevara or some subsidiary substitute who has some of the attributes of the mythological hero, of the central mythological hero, but is lacking many of them. And we mistake the political for the religious. And then the totalizing tendency there is, well, we know what that is. It's unbelievably dangerous because now you're an agent of God. And I think when you're an agent of God in the true sense.
See, and again, to go back to the critique from Rowson and David Fuller, this is, in a sense, when you take that status rocket ride like he did, the temptations just get worse. And when the temptations get worse, you tend to all of this capacity that we saw in Peterson, especially before things really got going for him after Kathy Newman, and then sort of the decadence of the book tour. And again, what I mean by decadence, I read about that. It's you're not actually coming into consummation. You're sort of spinning. You're not making progress.
What a horrible thing to contemplate, let's say, is that, well, that's when you're concerned more with your own sins, your own shortcomings, right, your own transgressions, and your inability to speak the truth. That's the proper way to focus.
This is, I think, a subject of fascination to everybody who listens to you, and certainly to me. Whenever I've talked to you, I can't help but ask you if you believe.
Another Justin Brierly here. But again, now he's going to go back to the belief thing, and again, that's Protestant confessionalism, and that in the wake of the Protestant Reformation, there needed a way to try to categorize people. And so with the fracturing that happens in the Protestant Reformation, now suddenly, infant baptism or believer baptism, to what degree does predestination involve in your system, on and on and on and on. And so you have all of this dogmatic Christian confessionalism trying to categorize people. And again, formal prescribed proposition belief is the way to keep order. And as I've said many times, it's not a bad system, but, and again, I'm gonna see, this is why I often don't like holding on to conversations, because I had an excellent conversation with Pastor Tanner, and now I'm referring to elements of that conversation, and I don't want to repeat it, but because it's difficult to repeat the context, but we're part of what's happening as we're losing modernity is that particular way of organization is increasingly losing its capacity, and that's happening at the local church level. It's because prior to, you could sort of keep people in pens, keep the sheep in pens, and you could control their feeding. And in the 20th century, the rise of mass media propaganda, the rise of the nation state, that capacity is lost. And as Pastor Tanner said, well, my phrasing of it, we sort of have to weaponize the sheep. Well, what do you mean? Well, everyone needs to sort of be able to be a thinker, a critical thinker, and process this. And, well, that very much, and the fact that members of my own local flock hear me 1 or 2 hours a week, and some of you, just in the one video I released yesterday, have been subject to my influence to a greater degree than my own congregation. And so we don't quite know where the sheep pens are. But now, of course, Klaven, this is his framework, and that's what he's going to use with Jordan. And fair enough, it is, because it's not just that Jordan uses stranger words with respect to act as if he believes, so on and so forth, but action in terms of course, as Peugeot leaned on him, attention, worship, participation, submission, all of these things form a matrix of identity and practice that mold us and shape us going forward.
Whenever I've talked to you, I can't help but ask you if you believe in God. And I've always felt that I was being kind of cruel, like a guy shooting at somebody's feet, to make them dance around. But even as you were
that's what Justin Brierley does.
Talking just now, I was thinking, I know you're a Jungian, and I'm not as big a fan of Jung as you are. And I've always thought that Jung didn't actually understand what faith was when he talked about the fact that we don't know.
Now, this is interesting, what he says about Jung, but that's where I really want to go with this in terms of, okay, what is faith? What is faith now? Faith in the confessional era of the Protestant Reformation was, we organized the sheep pens by, faith has this funny word, believe in terms of a propositional way, or much more participatory and performance, and I would say in terms of trust, which is much more perspectival.
Whether God is just our experience of the totality of things. I think people of faith know they don't know. That's why it's called faith and not knowledge. Have you changed? Recently I've watched interviews with you where you seem like you've gotten a more personal, you're having a more personal interaction with.
Is there movement? Is there movement here? Now again, Jordan very much adopts a modernist posture with respect to public and private on this. And so he's always sort of annoyed that people want to get into his business, because in the secular frame, faith is a private thing. Nothing in the New Testament says it's a private thing. In fact, when the language of the Christian Reformed Church, when you formally join the church, we call that a public profession of faith. And these are good words for what it is. And so, well, Jordan, here we are, shooting at your feet, prying into your private life. Let's go.
With this idea, is that fair?
Well, when I did a biblical lecture series on Genesis, which has proved to be quite popular, I suppose, if that's the right word for it.
Well, yeah, look at the YouTube stats. I'd say popular is true.
And I discovered while doing that the word Israel meant those who struggle with God. Right. Well, that's fair enough. And so then I'm a member of the camp of Israel. and
so, okay.
Is that faith? Well, I don't know. I've been accused of, wiggling out of this answer continually. And
and again, I don't think he does. And again, it's usually the Christians that accuse him of wiggling out of it, or it's rationality rules, and other atheists. But again, Peterson has been very consistent with this answer. And I've been, all the years I've been watching him, and you can go back a few years with videos.
I have to take refuge, in some sense, in my own ignorance. I'm striving towards what I perceive as the ideal. I attempt to be truthful in my speech and in my approach to life.
Now, he does so as an individual, and he does so in many ways depending on willpower, I think. And he sets up practices in his life too. He had a thing that I recently saw where he described, how he, if it makes you feel weaker, and I thought, boy, that's really clever, that's really insightful.
And to embody the classic virtues to the degree that I'm capable. And I believe that is faith, because that's what you stake your life on. Faith.
Yes, and I think he's right there, and I think that is faith. but it's sort of going it alone.
Faith is what you stake your life on.
And again, Vervaeke's 4 P's of knowledge, that's right. It's perspectival and it's participatory.
It isn't your agreement with a set of propositions. I believe that to be an improper interpretation of the word faith, because
And I agree with Peterson there.
faith is expressed in action. You have to make assumptions to proceed in life. Well, you do that in a marriage. Your marriage is held together by faith. Well, what does that mean? Does it mean you believe your wife exists?
Yes. Now, he would say, well, of course I believe my wife exists. But right there is, I mean, it's kind of a joke, but I think this is where you sort of get into God number one and his belief in God. And in fact, Klaven said, in terms of his interpretation of Jung, because there's God number one is about totality. God number two is about personality and agency. So, and this is, when he says this, I basically take this as, yeah, this is Peterson is right here. But again, he sort of does it alone.
No, that isn't what it means. It means that you've decided that you're going to bet your life on your marriage.
But you don't do that to someone whose existence you leave room for skepticism with.
And have I bet my life on God? Well, yes. Does that mean that I know that God exists? Well, how would I know?
See, and this is where the illustration, I think it's a terrific illustration. And do you know your wife exists? How do you know? Yes, you know.
I can't know, and neither can anyone else. That's the thing.
See, and what is it exactly doesn't he know? And I think, again, what he doesn't know is God number two, which is, the aspect of God that Sam Harris focuses on. And hence towards the end of Vancouver 1, where I first began to notice this God number one and God number two in terms of their conversation. Yeah, does he believe in God number one? Absolutely. God number two? Well, how does that lay out? How does that play out? What is the God number two-ness that he feels he can't know? And I think that's exactly where you get to this question of, well, I can talk to my wife and she answers. Does God hear? Does God answer? And now a lot of Christians will say, of course. Yeah. The entire practice of what secular society calls religion sees Christians doing that and is somewhat skeptical about it, because we sort of have been conditioned to think technologically, and when I open my cell phone, the lights come on and I can make a phone call and I can find something on the internet and my apps work. And God isn't like that, but neither are people necessarily. And so, again, it's right the crux here of God number one and God number two.
You can't know. And I also do understand that there are experiences that transcend the normative human there are experiences that transcend our normal realm, obviously, that they can be induced chemically, for example. There's a domain of spiritual experience. But I can't say that I understand what that means. I can just stand.
Knowing or understanding what it means. What's the relationship between those two?
Outside it in some sense and say, well, I do believe, for example, that what's central to Christianity, at least in part, is a centuries-long discussion about the nature of what's ideal. That seems to me to be perfectly obvious, and that a society has to do that because we want our young people, and our old people for that matter, to embody the ideal. I don't know what that ideal means metaphysically, right, in relationship to reality, because I don't understand, for example, the relationship between the objective and the subjective at all. And I don't understand consciousness at all. And I don't know what its metaphysical role in being is. I mean, from the objective perspective, it's nothing. But there isn't an objective perspective on consciousness, really. Right? It doesn't fit in there. It's the antithesis of the objective. But there it is. So I struggle along, and I share that with the people that are reading me and listening to me. And I think that's better. It works better that way as well.
Well, I can certainly see that last.
What does he mean by it works better that way? Better than what? Because better is a comparative. Better than in a church? And again, back to what I wrote in the Substack. Well, fans, I would argue, no, that's not better. Fans are not a church. Fans are the positionality isn't in order to do what it needs to do. And one of the Benjamin Boyce in my conversation with him asked me, what are my plans for my channel? It's like, well, I don't know. It depends what comes up in this crazy head of mine and what comes out on the crazy internet and what I decide to comment on. That's not entirely true. I certainly have long-term goals and directions, but I don't have them mapped out in the short term. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about maybe doing a little series on what I see as how I benefit from the specific practice and practices of my faith. Of being a Christian publicly, of practicing, of being involved in Christian practices, because I've been thinking about that a lot, and I find myself tremendously blessed, tremendously benefited from now years of Christian discipleship, that it makes it easy for me to fully understanding the pitfalls. And again, as a pastor, my colleague, I'll even mention his name, Mark Holland, who was did an internship and a residency with me, and then went on to plant another church in Sacramento. And because of COVID, his church is now using our property for meeting outside on Sunday mornings. It's beautiful out there at 9 a.m. I'd love to do it myself, except my older people would have difficulty on all of that uneven terrain, and I'm not willing to do that. I'm not willing to risk broken hips for that. But he's a pretty handy guy, and sometimes he likes doing projects around the church. So I mentioned a few weeks ago that our mailbox was stolen, and we have an open cardboard box sitting next to the building, which is our mailbox right now. So I have to get out there early and grab the mail so the homeless people don't go through it for me. And so we're putting in a mail slot, and he was doing that. And, we were talking about, pastor and sheep get into trouble. People leave the church. People can't believe anymore, so they throw it away. You have deconstructions. You have divorces. You have, just getting out of the habit. You have all sorts of things. There are many, many reasons being a pastor, many, many areas in which doubts can creep in. But the longer I go in this, the happier I am to have been raised in the faith and to have the church around me and to participate in the faith. And I know people give up the faith. I understand that. I remember asking my father died now 8 years ago, but I remember asking him when he had retired and was doing most of what he used to do for pay for free, just because he loved it so much, and saying, "Dad, what do you think? Or, what do you think about your vocation?" He says, "I love it more than ever," and I can see that, and I've got half my mom and half my dad really in me. Temperamentally, I'm quite really much a split of the two of them, whereas my older sister is more my dad and my younger sister was more my mom, but I'm really right in the middle. But I think about how happy and meaningful and fulfilling the faith is to me. And part of the reason for evangelism is I just quite simply want to share that with others. I think about Job's conversion, not Job in the Bible, but Job on the channel. You can see I have a playlist of all my conversations with Job just recently. A guy went through them all and was leaving new comments on them, and he's been going through all kinds of randos conversations on the channel and really loving it and leaving new comments. So, Phil, you know who you are, and I've been watching the comments come in, and good for you. That's a fun project. He was just recently looking at some of my conversations with Andrea. So, yeah, and, I watched Peugeot as a friend lean into Jordan and say, you don't have to suffer like this. Yet I know full well people in the church suffer too. And so I'm very hesitant to say, if you only get into the church, you won't suffer so much. Compare Paul of Tarsus's life before and after his conversion. Someone, if he sat down with the therapist might say, yeah, that conversion to Christianity, persecution, shipwreck, kind of seems like a bad move, don't you think? But of course, Paul would say, no. There's joy even in the midst of the suffering. So anyway.
Last point that you made, but I still think
It works better that way as well.
Well, I can certainly see that last point that you made, but I still think there's something missing from that explanation. It's absolutely certain that everything we experience is a human experience. Everything takes place in our consciousness. But when I sit on this chair, I'm essentially believing in my own sanity. I mean, when I have,
it's interesting how Klaven here sort of defaults to a Cartesian argument, and I find so many Christians bringing modernist arguments to a challenge like this, and I don't think they're going to work. I don't think they're going to work with Jordan. It's going to be, he's going to be pulled over the bridge more than pushed from modernity behind. Because it's I think actually modernity that is holding him back. And as Peugeot said, he's sort of like he's got a foot on each continent and they're moving apart, and it's like, don't jump back into modernist Christianity, jump forward into whatever it is we're going into now, hopefully without losing the benefits and the blessings that modernity gave. And this is where I'm sort of in a little different place than Jonathan Peugeot, because I understand the relationship between Protestantism and modernity, yet I remain a Protestant. It's a complicated business.
The experience of a moral universe, which I think you have to agree can't.
And if you read Klaven's book, these are the arguments that sort of push him over the edge. He runs through them, and he runs through them well. And again, not too different from C.S. Lewis.
Exist without a moral ideal. When you have the experience of a
That's basically C.S. Lewis's argument in the beginning of Mere Christianity.
Moral universe, and when reason has taken you to the point where you can see that ideal is something that you should follow, isn't it just believing in your own sanity to say, yes, God is there. That's what I believe in. I believe I don't believe my wife is there. I know my wife is there. I believe in my own sanity. I understand what you're saying, that sharing your struggle is helpful and useful, but it's...
And actually, the argument I'm writing for Unbelievable is basically making that point. Jordan and Douglas Murray and Tom Holland sharing their struggles are useful. And in the article, I have an admonition that don't try to push them off too quickly. And, the truth is none of them can be pushed too quickly. But again, I think they'll more be pulled over than pushed through.
At some point, don't you have to grasp that your perceptions are actually real if you were sane?
Sounds like Scottish common sense realism, and I don't think that approach is necessarily going to move him.
That's a good question, Andrew. I don't know the answer to that. Yeah. To grant under the conditions under which my perceptions are real. I mean, Are dreams real?
No.
Well, but they're
right, right there, and in some ways the line.
But they are my perceptions.
But they're really dreams.
They are real in that they're dreams, and they are representations of reality. And
But
I mean,
But if you dream that it rains, or if somebody chemically induces in you this experience that it rains, the crops still die because the rain hasn't fallen on the crops. If you see rain and the crops grow, then rain has fallen, right? There is a difference between our perceptions and our perceptions that are real. That's the difference between being
well, but that's exactly the issue. Is, you know, you said that you stake your sanity to some degree on your belief that your perceptions are real, but you don't, because some of your perceptions fall into the realm of the subjective and some of them fall into the realm of the objective. And there aren't any of us wise enough to.
This is where the subjective and the objective categories, again, I continue to find of decreasing utility, because, and again, that's why I think Peterson either needs to leap or be pulled over rather than pushed through.
To bridge the gap between those two realities. And I guess this is part of the reason that you also have a problem with Jung. I mean, I would say Jung certainly acted as if God existed. And when he was pressed, he said, I don't believe I know. It isn't obvious what he meant by that. But when he was pushed as a scientist or a scientifically minded thinker, he said, well, I can't be sure that our perception of the transcendent totality matches an external reality. Now, but that, it may not even have to, because this is something else I don't know. I mean,
as a pragmatist, he should be able to say, well, it's good enough.
To what degree is sublime religious experience subjective? Let's say it's not a manifestation of, it's not something you experience in the objective world. It's something you experience in the subjective world. But then people experience it across the subjective world, because religious experience is a human universal and it has patterns.
And now when he says across, now again, we're getting back into the communal from the individual, which again was one of the big themes in the Rebel Wisdom video and in my Jordan Petersonitis video and Substack that I wrote.
And structures that make it non-idiosyncratic. So it's transpersonal, but it's subjective. Well, we don't have a category in Western thought for transpersonal subjective, right? We think of transpersonal as objective, but there are experiences that are transpersonal and subjective. Well, what do we do with those? And are they real? Well, but
and this is why he's not going to flop back into modernistic Christianity. He's going to have to go forward into I think, understanding it in probably the ancient new way. And see, this has been going on in liturgy for a while. You know, I came back to North America in 97, and, you know, very quickly there was the seeker movement, and then there was the emergent movement, and the emergent movement was all about, you know, ancient contemporary. And whereas in the 80s and 90s, the cutting edge churches were very modernistic, in the aughts, they became very liturgical, weekly communion, very ancient. So
then that also does depend on what do you mean by real? Because we ask these questions and we don't notice that the questions themselves, especially when they're deep questions, what is real? Well, when you're asked a question like that, you have to ask the question, well, exactly what role does the word what in that sentence play, and is, and real? All of those are equally mysterious questions that are embedded within the question itself. And so those have to be taken apart. And that annoys people when I do that. But
it shouldn't, because he's really helping someone like me to do is to get sharper on where we're going religiously, because those are some of the vital questions we have to work our way through. We can't just take a step back on the continent of modernity. We're going to have to keep going on the next continent. We don't even have a label for it yet.
It doesn't matter, because when you ask about what's fundamental, you have to make sure that the tools that you're using to ask about what is fundamental are as fundamental as the question that you're trying to answer. And that's very, very difficult. I mean, because we are all split about what we mean by real too. Like, because we certainly all believe, at least to the degree that we are rational and scientific, which isn't that much, by the way. We certainly believe that, insofar as we're capable, that the objective and the scientific is real. But we act as if the subjective is real as well. So we certainly act as if other people are conscious, for example, and that matters and that they have free will, even though we can't make a completely coherent case for that. I mean, you can't make a coherent case for that can't be matched by an equally coherent case for the opposite, perhaps. At least it's debatable. But we certainly act as if other people are responsible for their actions, and so are we, and deserve to be rewarded when they're good and deserve to be punished when they're not good. And so we seem to accept those ethical propositions, and an ethical landscape is real. So,
and again, I don't think Klaven's going to be terribly happy with this, because I think in some ways, yeah, but I'm glad Klaven pushed him. And is Jordan in some ways holding back and suffering for it? Yeah, to that I agree with Klaven. Is it conscious? Is this completely under the domain of his will? Those are difficult questions. Again, and as a Calvinist, part of Calvinism is understanding with humility the limitation of our capacity to answer such questions. I mean, Christianity has always said multiple things. Certainly we must choose. But I think part of what Calvinist recognition has been is that understanding the boundaries of human choice is not such a simple thing. So
suffice it to say that all these things are very complex. I mean,
yet again, I agree with Klaven. Well, you're bringing some of absolutely they're complex, but part of what, and again, this is Petersonian stuff, in many ways, action, although it is embedded in more complexity than we have a lifetime to articulate. If narrative is a compression engine of combinatorially explosive reality, action is even more compressed. And pragmatists can understand that, because finally you say, I choose. I mean, Kierkegaard, this is where that goes.
In some sense, I feel when I'm asked that question is that I'm asked for a final answer. And like, man, I'd be pretty happy if I had a final answer, but I don't have a final answer.
I know, because you're looking for knowledge instead of faith. But
and I think Klaven's right there. That in some ways, you're not going to answer this with knowledge. You have to act. You have to jump. You have to leap. Yet and back in Peterson's camp, you need to do so. I'm not going to use that word authentically, but you need to do so honestly.
I'm just not bright enough. I just don't have it within.
None of us are, and people who are dozens of points down the IQ scale do it regularly. You know, God is pleased to give faith to the simple of the world, while the brilliant and the wise hover. And again, I'm not the hovering, if done well and done publicly and done honestly, blesses everyone else down the IQ scale. I've told the story before. This was before my time at the church. When I got here, we had a gentleman who had Down syndrome, and he was, when I got here, already in his 40s and had Down syndrome, so severely limited intellectually. And even years after he had done so, I'd hear former council members talk about the beauty of the moment when, at least in our church tradition, you meet with the church council to profess your faith before your public profession of faith. And just the profundity of that individual with Down syndrome expressing his faith to the council moved them deeply. So you're not going to think your way there. It's the wrong instrument. It's like, to get back to the wife illustration, well, who should you marry? You don't have enough knowledge to figure that out. Believing is, coming to Christ is more like falling in love than buying a sensible used car. You don't even have enough knowledge to buy a sensible used car. So I thought this was tremendous.
Have it in me.
Jordan,
the issue with Christianity. Sorry.
No.
Well, I see Christianity from the historical perspective as an extension of a discussion about the ideal that stretches back tens of thousands of years before the establishment of Christianity. There are precursors to what Christ represents in Mesopotamian thought and in Greek thought, and powerful, profound precursors. But
Tom Holland would say Persian too.
Idea changed, right? It transformed. And I don't know why it transformed. I don't know what the meaning of that is. It's not nothing. I have no idea why Christianity sprang out of nowhere and dominated the world in the mere span of 2,000 years.
And you don't want to wait until you figure it out, because it's sort of like all areas of knowledge. The more you know, the more you realize you don't know. It's not that type of thing.
It's a great mystery. Psychologically, I see it as part of the extended conversation about the nature of the ideal. Metaphysically, I'm at a loss. I don't know what to make of it. And so I keep trying to sort it out and to straighten it out in my own head. And I share that with people, but it's the best that I...
And you bless us with it. You do. But I do pray that you find rest for your soul.
Can do.
Well, it is very useful. Jordan, I wish I could continue this conversation with you for another hour.
I'd love to see Klaven in on this.
And a half, but I'm out of time. It's great to see you, and you're looking great, and I hope you'll come back and continue talking about this.
Yeah, well, it would be nice to see you in LA if this bloody pandemic ever disappears.
Well, I've left LA. I moved out of LA, so I'm going east. So, but I will.
Is he heading to? Everything's going in Nashville. I got friends in Nashville. You know who you are. You know I'm talking to you. So. Cool. Anyway, yeah, I said what I'm going to say. Thanks for watching. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think. And to use a Vervaekism, thank you for your time and attention.